Hello everyone, welcome back, thank you for joining us. In part 3 we will learn how to use Quixel Mixer in details and learn how to texture our project example, the house, to create a realistic material using our reference images that we have downloaded. Before we start, we would like to give you a heads up that we're gonna be using Quixel Mixer 2021.1, the new update that was released by Quixel a few days ago, and learn some of the new features that were added to the mixer. So let's get started. Now a question can be raised: why would we need to use Quixel Mixer to texture an architectural project where we can actually send the project to Unreal Engine using DataSmith after adding the material inside our modeling software? Or we can send it to Unreal Engine and use the Substance plugin as we have done in our previous project. The answer is sometimes you may get a request in your assigned commission project that your client requests specific textures on specific faces of your model, maybe even add some markers or logos on these faces. And that's the time when you're gonna need to unwrap your project as we have done, and then save that flattened data on a texture size, for example, let's say 4K, and then send that image to Photoshop. And then you're gonna start, for example, texture the faces. Let's say, for example, the floor. If we assume that this is the floor in our project, and then we're gonna start to fix that image and then fill this whole space with the floor texture, save it, and then assign it back in Blender to the model. And then that's gonna be like step one after adding the texture to the first face. But inside Quixel, this whole step or this whole process is being done in a matter of seconds. So basically we are assigning the texture to a 3D model, but the Quixel is actually translating this information to the 2D texture that we're gonna export it later. It sounds a little bit confusing, but once we start working on this model, it will be more clear. So in the new version that Quixel have released, there have been a few upgrades or improvements that have been done by the team. For instance, we have imported the project in our previous video and then assigned a material ID. If we, for example, assign just a simple material so we can see the material ID, we'll see, for example, after adding the material and then adding a material ID, also note that the base color have been removed. So now we can add the material directly without worrying about the base color that actually sometimes can be difficult to assign, like we have to change the color to match with the material that we have assigned. If we see actually also this separation between the faces, that means there's a displacement that have been applied, which we don't need actually for our project. Then what we're gonna need is to choose the material ID, and then as we did before, hit Q and choose which face we wanna assign this material. But in the new upgrade, we can actually import our model with from material. So if we, for example, assign the materials inside Blender, let's say, for example, this is an outwall tool, for example, and inside Quixel Mixer, I'm just gonna update the model again. Then if we choose the texture set from material, we'll see that the Quixel Mixer have separated the model inside a layer set that we can also need to add just a material. Then we'll see the layer set have been defined by the material. So for example, if we want to apply this material to outwall tool, as we have seen inside the Blender, this face, so it will apply to the selected face. So it's a really great improvement inside the software so far. So let's start texturing this project based on our image references that we have downloaded. To start, let's look at the outside wall at this side, for example, we can clearly see that this material reference is one of the stucco plaster material that is being used on the outside walls. If we look at a reference image for a stucco paint, we can see that it's composed of different layers of details. So we have a bit of noise, and also we have a kind of a brush that have been laid on top of these noise. So we're gonna do this by adding some layers of different materials we have selected from the local library or from the online library, and we download it to our local library. So we're gonna choose the out wall, and then we're gonna go to the local library. Let's choose a bluster material. You can see that now we have a bunch of different stucco facade that we have downloaded from the online library. So we're gonna start, for example, by this one. Now let's start by disabling the displacement, because this is not part of our details that we're gonna apply for that facade. And then when we look at the options, we have a blending options that we're gonna work with them later once we add another layer of material. As for the placement, we have 3 different types of scaling this material to that face. Basically the tiling, which we know adding X and Y values that will repeat the map based on its scale, and the box projection and the freeform. The freeform is basically when you have like a 3D objects that's gonna be, let's say, for example, like the photogrammy thing. And the box projection is basically it will increase the material scale without repeating it. So basically you're gonna keep scaling it up or down without having the same effect as the tiling. So if we head to the tiling, which we're gonna use in this material, we'll see that the material needs to be scaled down. Let's say, for example, around 8 by 8. And once we zoom in a little bit, you'll start to see that the material is a little bit out of scale, or the resolution of that material is not really clear. There are 2 things that should be pointed here. The first one is the texel density of this face inside the 2D texture that we have created inside Blender. So let's discuss this in details. Assuming, for example, we have a 2 identical texture size. This one is what we got from Blender. It's basically an 8K texture, and this is an 8K texture of the wood texture that we got from Quixel Mixer. You can basically find these textures once you download them and right click show in Explorer. It will show you the texture files inside your hard disk. So when we dragged our 8K texture and on top of our unwrapped 8K texture also, the Quixel Mixer started to minimize the scale of that image until it reaches, for example, to the scale that we prefer. What we can see here is the pixels of that texture after it have been scaled down. So you can obviously see that there's lots of data have been lost during this scale down process. So to solve that, we need to increase the size of that face on top of the texture. Let's assume, for example, that instead of having that face of the floor, this size inside that texture, it can be increased. So at least when Quixel start to minimize the scale of that texture, we will not lose that much of details. So how can we do that inside Blender? There is a very useful add-on that was created by a member called Marvin, and it's actually free. You can download it from Gumroad or GitHub. And once you download this add-on help you to measure the density of your unwrapped faces inside your UV editing face. So how can we do that? Let's see if we can choose all the faces and head to our texture here. Let's create a 4K texture that we're gonna use to unwrap our model 2. So here is our unwrapped faces. I'm gonna hit N. After installing your add-on, basically download and install as we have done it in our previous video, you'll go to the Texel Density and you can define your texture size first, which we have defined before, 4K. Then let's choose one of these faces by heading to the selection mode and then calculate our texel density. It shows that this face has 1.398. We want to read more information regarding this by looking into a texture tool reference measurement. So again, inside our Texel tool add-on that we have installed in our previous video, let's set the size to 4K as we have defined. And let's load our checker map that is created by the Texel tool add-on to show you the size or the texel density of that face. So if we look at this face, for example, and hit S to scale this up, you'll see the more you're scaling up that face, the more you're getting density, or what we call, for example, pixel resolution for that face. So once the image that we're gonna choose, for example, inside Quixel image mixer will be loaded to that face, it doesn't need to be scaled down and lose all of the data as we have seen before. But still, we have a 4K texture wide and height that make the model limited to that space. So how can we work this around? So let's create an 8K texture, for example, just to increase the size. And this is keep in mind that Quixel Mixer only support a resolution of 8K. You can for sure create a 16K inside Blender and increase the size for your texel density, but unfortunately at the moment Quixel Mixer cannot support more than 8K. Let's hope they will work on that on their future versions. So I'm gonna go to the width, multiply this by 8, the same goes here, and hit OK. And then let's unwrap this. Okay, so if we hit an N again and go to the Texel tool first, make sure to set your size to 8K so you can read the correct checker map resolution. So if we hit this, we can see now that the resolution have been translated to that size. And again, the texel density, set the size to our 8K texture. And seems like sorry about that, 8192. And if we now choose all our faces, let's choose this face, for example, selection mode, let's make it to the full one, calculate. It's a 2.796 compared to, I think it was like 1 point something. So we can still increase the texel density and still gain more resolution inside Quixel Mixer, which we actually need. You will not face this problem if you're working, for example, on a gaming model or something, because the scale most probably for a character or even a small box or a small model will not be at this size. This problem only happens if you, for example, working on a bigger scale objects, that when you unwrap them to the texture map, they will consume a lot of space of that 2D texture. But the way to solve this is by defining which part of our project that we actually need to unwrap to that 8K resolution texture. And this can be easily answered by defining which side of your project that will need a higher close-up camera view inside Unreal Engine. I would suggest at the beginning, for example, that we don't need to unwrap the windows faces at this moment, so we can hide these. So if we unwrap these faces all together, at least we can get more space inside our texture. So if we hit again unwrap, let's choose all of them, tab, then smart UV unwrap. Okay, so now if we go again to our texel density, let's choose this, for example, and make sure that it's set again to 8K. we calculate this, we can see that we are getting more increase in the value. Again, let's for example divide this. Maybe we need these walls to come later on if we want to add more detail to it. Along with the bathroom tiles, let's hide them. Let's get these guys only here. So I'm gonna select them all again, hit tab, unwrap them, and let's look now at our unwrap texture. Now we can do a little bit of a manual work that I'm guessing not all of us are a fan of this, but it's actually help, and it's most of the time it's required to solve this part. So assuming for example we want to increase this to even higher than this value, let's say for example we can work on these guys to move them at this level, and then take this part, hit G to move it. Let's say for example we want to set this value to 4, and if we set our textile density to 4, that means that we can copy the textile density that we have set to that part again to the other parts. So for example we can set to this small face, so the same density pixel that we have set up for example for that floor. Also another tip that we forgot to mention, for example this is a floor face that we have created earlier. We don't actually also need the underground face that we're not gonna see inside Unreal Engine. So any faces that you're gonna show inside your render, you actually need them, so you can delete them to save more space for the other objects. So I'm gonna continue working on this to just fix it, and then head back to Quixel Mixer and continue working on that. So now back in Quixel Mixer, I'm gonna re-import our model after adjusting the scale of that texture. If we look now into the texture, we can now start to see, I'm pressing on on Alt and right click, we can zoom in. So you can obviously see that there is an improvement on the texture size. Now the second reason is our current resolution preview inside Quixel Mixer is 4K, and keep in mind that Quixel team have defined that it's really important to know that 8K resolution preview will consume a lots of your computer memory, especially the GPU, and may cause the mixer to shut down. So it's still under experiment. They're still experimenting ways to control this kind of memory consumption. So until then, you can still review it and go back. So let's see, for example, if we can hit save first, and then go to the texture resolution and try to review that. I might stop the recordings just so we can review this after it's finished. So this is the warning that this is not currently a safe way to do that. Okay, so now after the 8K resolution have finished loading all the 8K resolution size inside the texture, you can see now that the resolution is much better, and the way this look now inside the mixer without even adding all the other effects like the lighting or the baking, it still looks pretty good. So let's continue adding the other layers of the texture to reach to our image reference material. I'm just gonna go back again to the 4K resolution. So let's add another material layer on top of this. So I'm gonna go to the local library and choose another stack of facade. Have a little bit of a bigger scale details on top of the texture. Again, we have to disable the displacement and make sure that this is also applied to the same layer set that we have chosen. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go to the tiling and work on the repetition of that material. Let's say around maybe 11 by 11. So I now have a bunch of more details on top of that material. So Now going to the blend option, let's set this, for example, that it's gonna come from above, and I'm gonna choose how the opacity of that details is gonna come. So looking at this point, let's increase a little bit the threshold and the tails. And we have also something called the height frequency that can increase also the details a little bit, not that much. And again, the scale that you can choose how you want to apply this on top of the other one, of the other material. So maybe this needs a little bit also of another layer on top of it. So I'm just gonna increase the brightness of this one. Let's bring another layer, for example, let's bring this. Okay, again, disable the displacement. You can see now that the color is a little bit darker, and the good thing about Quixel Mixer that you can actually change the color of the texture and the albedo channel. So now we have this kind of bump that we're looking at on our image reference. You still can control it actually. So if you just go to that image that represent that texture, double click here, so you can see that this bump need to be a little bit reduced. Sorry about that. So let's scale it down a little bit. Maybe also work on the opacity a little bit. Maybe even more, so it can be hardly seen. Increase the preserved details. So now we can actually change the light direction to review this by pressing on Shift and clicking on the right mouse button and move it side to side. So now if we hit our lighting to come from this direction, you can see that we can still work on that level of details, even on the scale a little bit. This is where we can see that we can start to get more details in the texture, maybe even decrease the scale of this one. Let's put it 15 to 15. Last thing we need to add, if we look again on our image reference, that even with a new building or an old building, you can see that there's some kind of a color leak. Sometimes it comes from this point of the highest top of that ceiling, and sometimes you're getting this kind of details of the dirt on the bottom of that wall. To apply this in Mixer, we can basically apply a solid color on top of this set. So we can set this color, a gray is okay, and then we're gonna add a new tool called a mask stack. This basically is one of the really amazing features inside Quixel Mixer. When you go to the options of that mask components, you can see that there's lots of mask options that we can apply to our model. So in this video, we're gonna work with the position gradient, and this is basically a mask that can determine which direction you want this color to be applied for. So if we have choosing above, for example, we have also the range of that color on top of the model that we can control from both sides, and even if you press Shift, you can move them together. You can still actually control how the color can be achieved, and we can go back to the solid color and also decrease the opacity a little bit. So you can see that there's a bit of leak coming from above, and we can also again duplicate this and get that leak even from the ground level. So if we head to the mask stack, bring it from below, even more, maybe more, increase the opacity a little bit, work with the range a little bit, make it comes from the ground a little bit, maybe decrease the opacity. And here we have our wall details set on one single material. Another useful tool inside Quixel Mixer that we want to point out is the paint layer. Let's assume, for example, that we want to add a damaged wall layer on top of the material, and we want to add this through a paint tool using a specific brush that will give us a nice detail on top of that wall. So the first thing we're gonna need to do is to remove the displacement again, and then we're gonna right click and choose Add Paint Mask. This will create a paint layer mask that you can change how this mask will be displayed on your wall by changing the brush type. First, let's remove the layer of that material from our wall. So I'm gonna choose the circle brush, and then I'm gonna paint on top of the material. First, let's make sure it's the value is black, so we can remove all of the texture details and then paint it back using the brush that we're gonna choose. So to access the brush, just go to the brushes, and you will immediately see lots of different brushes that you can use. The one that we have downloaded is called the leakage brush. Once you download it, it will be displayed automatically inside the brushes settings. So we're gonna choose that, and we're gonna change the value of the brush color by pressing X to white, and we're gonna just try to display it on this part, for example. And once we paint on top of that, we can keep continuing on the bottom part just as much as we can, and then we can go to the material setting and even change the opacity. Even the color also, we can change it to something more dark gray or something. So the material that we have added by the brush can also be used to increase the details of that layer. We can even increase the scale. Let's say, for example, a tiling option, and let's increase the opacity a little bit. So this will help add more details to your architectural facade. Not necessary to be like a fully damaged wall, but just to give you more details that will help you inside Unreal Engine to increase the quality of your realism. Okay, so let's wrap this up by adding another material for the floor, for example. So let's add another layer set, and for this one we're gonna choose the floor only. So I'm gonna go to our local library and choose a wooden floor texture. Okay, so once it's downloaded and displayed on the layer, you can change the placement to be tiled and even increase the tiling. Sorry about that. So let's drag the X and Y repetition from the circle between them so it can increase the tiling immediately, and change the rotation angle to 90 degrees. Let's see how the material is looking by dragging even the lighting from that direction. So if we just minimize the scale a little bit, we can see we are gaining more details from that texture after increasing the texel density. So we're gonna keep adding more details also to the other objects of our model, and then once we finished, we're gonna export this back to Blender and send this to Unreal Engine. So hope this video, guys, helped you to understand Quixel Mixer in details and to how to use it with architectural model. If you have any questions, please share it down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.